Imagine waking up one morning to realize that every ache in your body, every labored breath, every foggy thought, is not an accident of fate but the direct consequence of choices made centuries before you were born. Your trembling hands, the way your spine curves painfully, the sense of being trapped in a body that fails you. None of it is truly yours. It was written into your bones long before your first cry. You are not cursed by the gods, nor by chance, but by a family tree twisted into a noose, where cousins marry cousins, where uncles wed their nieces, and where purity of bloodline was valued above the very lives it created. This horrifying reality was no fantasy. For centuries, Europe's most powerful families believed that the sacred spark of rulership flowed in their veins, and that diluting it with the blood of outsiders was unthinkable. To preserve their supposed divine right to rule, they married each other, again and again, until love was a stranger and genetics became a loaded weapon turned inward. The Catholic Church, which might have drawn a boundary, instead granted dispensations with astonishing ease. Marriage between first cousins? Approved. Uncle and niece? With enough gold and influence, also approved. 4 kings and queens, the rules of ordinary morality bent until they broke. In the gilded halls of Vienna, Madrid, and Paris, preserving dynasties mattered more than preserving life. The common belief was that noble blood was not only more refined but more sacred, imbued with a touch of heaven itself. To let it mingle with the blood of peasants or foreigners was seen as both dangerous and sacrilegious. But the irony is as cruel as it is sharp. The very obsession with purity corroded the bloodline from within. What began as a strategy to protect power became the seeds of its undoing. By the 16th century, Europe's royal families had become less a network of alliances and more a single sprawling clan. It wasn't just cousins marrying cousins, it was an entire continent of rulers tracing their ancestry back to the same ancestors, weaving their destinies into one suffocating web. The Habsburgs of Austria and Spain perfected this art of political matrimony. Their unofficial motto, often whispered with grim humor, was, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." And marry they did. Their family tree does not branch outward, it folds in on itself, winding tighter with each generation until it resembles not a flourishing oak but a strangled vine. What they could not have understood at the time was that every such union doubled the risk of hidden recessive genes colliding, producing children who bore not only crowns but unbearable burdens of disease, deformity, and despair. Our journey into this dark tapestry begins in Vienna, in 1634, in the shadowed corridors of the Hofburg Palace. A child is born, Maria Anna of Austria. From her first breath, she is heir not only to grandeur but to suffering already inscribed in her DNA. She enters the world with the infamous Habsburg jaw, mandibular prognathism, her lower face jutting forward in a way that makes chewing a daily battle. Her spine curves unnaturally, pressing her lungs so that even the act of drawing air is a strain. Her steps are slow, faltering, unsteady. While other children run through palace gardens, she lingers behind, gasping for breath, her body weighed down by invisible chains. Servants learn to cut her food into tiny, softened pieces. Even then, meals become exhausting rituals. Bite, chew, swallow, pause to rest. Eating is no pleasure but a gauntlet she must endure 3 times a day. Yet her physical pain, brutal as it is, may not have been the worst affliction. There was also the psychological torment of understanding why she suffered. The palace walls were covered with portraits of her ancestors, stern-faced men and elaborately dressed women whose features, once regal, now seemed to echo like a warning. In the tilt of an uncle's jaw, in the stiffness of a grandmother's posture, Maria Anna could trace the reflection of her own deformities. She was not alone in her misery, but part of a long, unbroken chain of damage. Court physicians hovered around her, their faces masks of polite detachment. They measured the bend of her back, sketched the jut of her jaw, tested the frailty of her limbs. They whispered among themselves of the Habsburg curse, but never to her face. To her, they spoke of mysterious ailments and divine trials, of God's inscrutable will. But the truth was clear to anyone who dared admit it. Maria Anna's suffering was not divine punishment. It was human design, an experiment in dynasty, paid for in blood and bone. She lived much of her life behind drawn curtains, hidden from the gaze of outsiders, as though her body's testimony was too shameful for the world to see. And yet, in her confinement, her mind flourished. She read voraciously, devouring books that described worlds where love, not lineage, determined a union, and where children were not born predamned by ancestral vanity. For Maria Anna, the imagination was her only escape, books the only places where her body was not a prison. But escape, however brief, could not erase reality. Suitors came and went, many of them cousins, but recoiled when confronted with the reality of her condition. Marriage negotiations sputtered, failed, dissolved. Even in a world where marrying one's cousin was commonplace, Maria Anna's health was too fragile to disguise. She became a princess without prospects, a woman denied the very role her society demanded of her: to marry, to reproduce, to extend the line. She did not live long. At the age of 32, her body finally surrendered, worn out by decades of genetic weight too heavy for a single frame. The official documents listed fevers, respiratory failure, mysterious ailments. Nowhere did they write the real cause. Maria Anna died because her family refused to see beyond its obsession. She died because purity mattered more than compassion, because ambition outweighed humanity. Her story is not a tragic exception but the beginning of a pattern, one that would repeat with ruthless regularity across Europe's most glittering palaces. The young women of the Habsburg line, destined for crowns and gowns, would instead inherit chains of bone and blood. And Maria Anna's short life, spent in pain and seclusion, serves as the first echo of a chorus that would resound for centuries. If Maria Anna of Austria's life was a slow tragedy written into her bones, Joanna of Castile's was a storm, sudden, violent, and unforgettable. Born in 1479, she was the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the Catholic monarchs whose reign reshaped Spain and the world. They expelled Jews and Muslims from their lands, they funded Columbus's voyages, and they forged the union that became the foundation of a Spanish empire. In that empire, Joanna seemed destined for greatness. She was intelligent, strikingly beautiful, and more educated than most men of her age. She spoke Latin fluently, mastered French and Flemish, and read philosophy and theology with ease. In another world, her brilliance might have shone unimpeded. But in the world she inherited, her mind and heart were caged long before her first act of defiance. For Joanna was also a Habsburg by blood. Her parents, cousins, had woven her into the great dynastic web of Europe. And though her childhood did not show obvious signs of deformity or disease, the seeds of her downfall lay both in her genes and in the merciless political system that treated her not as a daughter but as a bargaining chip. At 16, Joanna was married off to Philip of Burgundy, better known as Philip the Handsome. The match was designed to strengthen Spain's alliances with the powerful Habsburgs of the Low Countries. To the courts of Europe, it was a triumph. To Joanna, it was the beginning of a long descent. Philip's nickname tells only part of the story. Handsome, yes. Charming, certainly. But he was also cold, arrogant, and faithless. He had no intention of being a devoted husband. His mistresses were many, his cruelty subtle but relentless. For a young woman raised in the suffocating sanctity of Spanish Catholicism, the betrayal was unbearable. Joanna clung to him with a desperate, obsessive love that terrified those around her. Her jealousy was volcanic. If Philip so much as glanced at another woman, Joanna erupted, screaming, weeping, begging. Courtiers whispered that she was mad, but what they called madness may have been the raw human reaction of a woman abandoned, humiliated, and trapped in a marriage that could not be escaped. When Philip died suddenly in 1506 at just 28 years old, Joanna's grief shattered what remained of her fragile stability. To lose the man she had loved with such ferocity, even if he had repaid her love with cruelty, was like ripping her heart from her chest. Her reaction became infamous, cementing her legacy for centuries. She refused to bury his body. Across Spain, Joanna traveled with Philip's coffin, insisting that it remain near her. At night she demanded it be placed in her chambers. More than once, she ordered the casket opened so she could gaze upon his decomposing face, sometimes even kissing the cold, decayed lips. To modern eyes, the image is grotesque, unbearable. But to her, it was the only way to keep alive the bond that defined her existence. This was the moment history branded her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. But was she truly insane? Or was her grief merely too raw, too public, too unbecoming of a queen? Her father Ferdinand thought her instability convenient. With Philip dead, Joanna was the rightful queen of Castile. But a queen with independent authority was a dangerous thing. So Ferdinand declared her unfit to rule, confining her under the pretext of care. When Ferdinand died, her son Charles, later the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, did the same. For 46 years, Joanna lived in confinement at the convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas. The conditions were less sanctuary than prison. She was kept in dim, cold rooms. She was denied proper bathing, often left filthy for weeks. Food was rationed, not out of scarcity but to keep her weak. Attendants reported that she tore her clothes, screamed for hours, and refused to eat. But who would not begin to unravel after decades of isolation, grief, and neglect? Historians today increasingly question whether Joanna was ever truly mad at all. Her so-called madness aligned perfectly with the ambitions of the men around her. Men who wanted power unchallenged by a queen with her own authority. Her father needed her silenced. Her son, eager to expand his empire, needed her locked away as a political irrelevance. Madness was the perfect excuse. Still, the genetic legacy cannot be ignored. The Habsburg line was riddled with mental illness, depression, anxiety, psychotic breaks. Her grandmother Isabella of Portugal had suffered prolonged bouts of melancholy. Her daughter Catherine would later show signs of severe depression. In Joanna, biology and circumstance collided with cruel force. But perhaps the greater tragedy is how her story was remembered. For centuries, she was reduced to a caricature. The raving widow clutching a corpse, the mad woman of Castile. Rarely was she acknowledged as a scholar, a mother, or a queen whose authority was systematically stripped from her. When Joanna died in 1555, after nearly half a century of confinement, the world barely noticed. The chroniclers wrote of a mad queen passing quietly in her cell. But what if we see her differently? Not as a madwoman, but as a victim. A victim of genetic fragility, yes, but even more, a victim of patriarchy, of dynastic politics, of a system that found it easier to brand a woman insane than to accept her as sovereign. Her coffin, unlike Philip's, was not carried across kingdoms. Her memory was buried under centuries of gossip and dismissal. Yet her story lingers like a haunting refrain, raising questions that history still struggles to answer. Was Joanna truly mad? Or did a lifetime of betrayal, grief, and calculated imprisonment drive her to the edge? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps her so-called madness was less a sickness of the mind than a mirror reflecting the sickness of a system that caged her. And in that mirror, we begin to see not only Joanna's shadow but the looming specter of the Habsburg legacy itself, a dynasty where blood was sacred, women were expendable, and madness became the language of power. If Joanna of Castile's life was defined by grief and confinement, Margaret Theresa of Spain's life was defined by the weight of expectation, an expectation so immense that it consumed her before she even reached adulthood. She was born in 1651, in the glittering yet decaying court of Madrid, the daughter of Philip IV of Spain and his niece, Maria Anna of Austria. Yes, his niece. By this point in history, the Habsburg dynasty had become so entangled in its obsession with blood purity that such pairings were not only tolerated but celebrated. The closer the blood, the more secure the throne. From her earliest days, Margaret Theresa was more symbol than child. Her birth was heralded across Europe as a triumph, a new thread in the fragile tapestry of Habsburg power. For courtiers, she was not a little girl with soft hands and innocent eyes. She was a living treaty, a vessel of dynastic continuity, a future empress promised to her uncle Leopold I of the Holy Roman Empire. The engagement was arranged when she was only a toddler. The marriage contract became an inevitability long before she could even speak. And yet, through the brush of one man, her face became immortal. Diego Velázquez, the court painter of Spain, captured Margaret Theresa in a series of portraits that remain among the most haunting images of the Baroque age. In the most famous, Las Meninas, she is at the center, a small girl dressed in stiff, ornate court gowns, surrounded by ladies-in-waiting, dwarfs, and the painter himself. She is not smiling. She does not play. Instead, she gazes out at the viewer with a gravity far beyond her years, as though aware that her life will not be her own. Velázquez's paintings are more than art. They are subtle chronicles of genetic decay. Look closely at Margaret Theresa's face. The faint protrusion of her jaw, the distant glaze in her eyes, the stiffness of her posture. Velázquez, ever the master of truth hidden in beauty, painted her as her family wanted the world to see, a radiant young princess. But beneath the silks and ribbons, he could not conceal the toll of generations of cousin marriages. Her childhood was not filled with games or laughter. While other children tumbled in gardens, she was paraded in brocade, her tiny frame swallowed by the gowns of a queen-in-waiting. Every lesson she learned, from languages to music to court etiquette, was aimed not at enriching her spirit, but at preparing her to fulfill her singular purpose, to marry her uncle and produce heirs strong enough to carry on a line already collapsing under its own genetic weight. At 15, the inevitable became reality. She was wed to Leopold I, a man more than a decade her senior and, disturbingly, her own uncle. The marriage was celebrated with grand ceremonies, lavish banquets, and diplomatic fanfare. To the Habsburg courts, it was a triumph of continuity, a reinforcement of power. To Margaret Theresa, it was the death of whatever childhood she had left. Marriage was not merely a political union, it was a biological crucible. Almost immediately, Margaret Theresa was expected to conceive. Her body, still fragile, was pushed into the brutal rhythm of constant pregnancies. The first child, a daughter, lived only a few months. Her second pregnancy ended in miscarriage. The court murmured anxiously, physicians scribbled notes, priests urged prayers. And finally, when she delivered a son who survived infancy, relief swept the dynasty. The child was hailed as the hope of the Habsburg line, until it became clear that he, too, bore the very deformities and weaknesses that had plagued the family for generations. Each pregnancy weakened her further. The medical knowledge of the time was rudimentary at best, and her physicians treated her as a vessel rather than a patient. She suffered from what modern doctors would recognize as severe anemia, epileptic seizures, and chronic respiratory illness. Yet the palace records rarely described her agony with humanity. Instead, they treated her like a failing experiment, documenting symptoms, adjusting rituals, prescribing endless prayers and bloodletting. As Margaret Theresa declined, so too did the illusion that dynastic purity could shield the Habsburgs from collapse. Witnesses described her as frail, pale, and exhausted, her once bright eyes dulled by fatigue. The marriage that was supposed to secure the dynasty instead amplified its fragility. She died in 1673, at only 21 years old. The official cause of death was listed vaguely as fever. But the truth was far more complex. She died because her body was simply too weak, too ravaged by genetic inheritance and the relentless toll of repeated childbirth. She had been reduced to little more than her womb, and when that womb could no longer endure, her value to the dynasty, and her life itself, ended. What is most haunting is not only her early death, but the way she is remembered. In Velázquez's paintings, she remains forever a child, golden-haired, innocent, staring out from the canvas with eyes that seem to plead for a different fate. Those portraits, now displayed in museums, are admired for their artistry. Yet behind the brushstrokes lies a silent cry. The girl who looks out at us across centuries is not simply a princess. She is a prisoner of her bloodline, a victim of decisions made by ancestors who cared more for empire than for flesh and bone. Margaret Theresa's life embodies the central paradox of the Habsburg dynasty. The more they sought to preserve themselves through purity, the more they destroyed themselves from within. And in the shadow of her short, tragic life, we see a dynasty staggering toward collapse, its survival bought at the cost of its children's bodies, its daughters' lives, and its humanity. If Margaret Theresa of Spain was a child bound to a fate she could not escape, Anna of Austria's tragedy lay in being torn from one world and thrust into another that never truly accepted her. Born in 1601, Anna was the daughter of Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, yet another union between uncle and niece. From the beginning, she bore the silent inheritance of Habsburg fragility, a protruding jaw, a timid demeanor, and the anxious temperament that plagued so many in her bloodline. In 1615, when she was only 14, Anna was married off to Louis XIII of France. The union was meant to cement peace between Spain and France, two kingdoms that had been enemies for decades. Diplomatically, it was hailed as a triumph, a brilliant maneuver to weave fragile threads of trust between rival crowns. Personally, it was an upheaval. A young girl, barely more than a child, was uprooted from the familiar splendor of Madrid and deposited into the gilded cage of the French court. At first, Versailles welcomed her with pageantry. There were processions, banquets, fireworks, outward signs of joy that masked the unease simmering beneath. Anna spoke little French and clung to her Spanish customs. Her accent, her manners, her retinue, all became points of gossip. Courtiers whispered that she was aloof, too foreign, too pious. She was the daughter of Spain, after all, the sworn enemy, and her presence was a reminder that alliances were fragile, stitched together by necessity rather than trust. Her husband, Louis XIII, offered little comfort. He was a complex man, melancholic, withdrawn, and emotionally distant. Some historians suggest he struggled with his own suppressed desires and depressive episodes. What is clear is that he had no patience for intimacy with his young wife. Their marriage was cold, a union of crowns but not of hearts. For Anna, the isolation was crushing. She was expected to adapt immediately to a new language, new rituals, and a husband who rarely spoke to her. In an era where a queen's worth was measured almost entirely by her ability to produce heirs, her early failures became public humiliations. Her first pregnancies ended in miscarriage. Others produced infants who lived only hours or days. Each loss was not a private sorrow but a political scandal. France, desperate for stability, needed an heir. Every time Anna emerged from her chambers empty-armed, the whispers grew louder. She was cursed, she was barren, she was unfit. Medicine at the time offered no comfort, only cruelty. Court physicians prescribed brutal treatments, bloodletting, purging, restrictive diets. They examined her intimately, probing for defects in her feminine nature, as they put it. In reality, they were dissecting her dignity piece by piece. No one dared consider that the problem might not be Anna at all, but the genetic inheritance she carried, centuries of inbreeding woven into her veins. The humiliation broke her spirit. She retreated into her apartments, often refusing to appear in public. Her faith, once a source of strength, became an obsession. She prayed for hours, clutching rosaries until her knuckles bled, convinced that only divine intervention could redeem her. Some said she had grown paranoid, afraid to step into the sunlight, afraid of the judgmental eyes of a court that saw her as both foreigner and failure. Her relationship with Louis XIII deteriorated further. They lived almost as strangers, sharing little beyond ceremonial duties. Yet duty pressed on. Every year that passed without a male heir was a year closer to potential dynastic collapse. France whispered of replacing her, of annulling the marriage, of seeking a new queen. And then, against all odds, came a miracle. After 23 barren years, Anna gave birth to a healthy son, the future Louis XIV, later known as the Sun King. The child's survival was hailed as nothing less than divine providence. Across France, church bells rang, fireworks lit the sky, and the people rejoiced. The Spanish queen had finally delivered. 2 years later, she bore a second son, Philippe, securing the line of succession. For the court, it was triumph. For Anna, it was a reprieve, but not a redemption. Her health remained fragile. The years of failed pregnancies, of harsh treatments and crushing anxiety, had left scars no miracle birth could erase. She remained a woman hollowed by decades of pressure, still plagued by melancholy, still treated with suspicion. Her later years were marked by ill health, digestive troubles, respiratory ailments, attacks of what physicians called melancholia, that left her bedridden for days. Modern doctors would recognize them as bouts of severe depression and anxiety, exacerbated by her genetic predispositions and the relentless weight of her role. Anna died in 1666, having lived long enough to see her son Louis XIV rise as one of Europe's most powerful monarchs. History remembers her chiefly for giving birth to the Sun King. Yet beneath that grand legacy lies a quieter, crueler truth. She was a woman consumed by the same obsession that destroyed so many Habsburg women. Her worth was reduced to her womb, her failures magnified by gossip, her humanity overlooked in the pursuit of dynastic security. She had been, from beginning to end, an isolated queen. Isolated by bloodline, by foreignness, by marriage, and by the crushing loneliness of a court that saw her not as Anna, but as a vessel. And in her solitude, we glimpse the recurring theme of the Habsburg tragedy. Women raised to be queens, reduced to suffering shadows of themselves, sacrificed for a purity that poisoned them. If Anna of Austria's life ended in weary resignation, Marie Antoinette's ended in spectacle, the world watching as her head fell into a basket beneath the guillotine. Yet beneath the political fury of the French Revolution lies another quieter tragedy, the way centuries of dynastic obsession had shaped her body, her mind, and her destiny before she ever set foot in France. Marie Antoinette was born in 1755 in Vienna, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor. Hers was not the kind of tightly woven uncle-niece marriage that had so badly scarred earlier Habsburg generations, but the genetic legacy of centuries of inbreeding still lingered. She inherited what painters politely softened but never quite erased, the protruding lower lip, the unmistakable trace of the Habsburg jawline. At 14, she was sent to France as a bride for the Dauphin, the awkward young man who would become Louis XVI. The marriage was meant to strengthen the bond between two great dynasties, Austria and France. For Marie, it was an uprooting as severe as Anna of Austria's had been more than a century earlier. She left her homeland, her language, her family, and stepped into the glittering labyrinth of Versailles. At first glance, her portraits painted by Elizabeth V. G. Lebrun show a radiant queen, luminous in silk and pearls. But behind the brushstrokes lay struggles invisible to the eye. Like so many Habsburg daughters before her, Marie Antoinette suffered from profound reproductive difficulties. Court physicians recorded her feminine troubles, severe menstrual problems, repeated miscarriages, and hormonal imbalances. Her marriage to Louis XVI only compounded the problem. Both teenagers were inexperienced, nervous, and, as modern historians suggest, carrying their own genetic burdens. Louis was socially awkward, possibly neurodivergent, with developmental delays that made intimacy difficult. For 7 years, their marriage remained unconsummated. 7 years without an heir. At Versailles, where gossip was currency, this failure became blood sport. Rumors spread that Louis was impotent, that Marie was frigid, that the marriage bed was cursed. Pamphlets mocked her mercilessly, portraying her as both seductress and failure, an object of ridicule whether she acted or remained passive. Court physicians poked and prodded, searching her body for flaws, while ignoring the possibility that the problem lay with Louis, or with the centuries of genetics behind them both. When she finally conceived, her relief was immense. Her first child, a daughter, was healthy, but the court wanted sons. The pressure only grew. Subsequent pregnancies ended in miscarriages or infant deaths, each one draining her spirit further. Anxiety attacks plagued her. What we would now call prenatal and postpartum depression haunted her days. She was only in her 20s, yet the weight of centuries pressed down on her like an iron shroud. But history is cruel. Marie Antoinette's struggles as a mother became ammunition for her enemies. In a France teetering on the edge of revolution, she was painted not as a woman fighting invisible battles of body and mind, but as a monster of extravagance. The nickname Madame Deficit followed her, as though she alone were responsible for France's collapsing finances. And then came the most famous slander of all, "Let them eat cake." She almost certainly never said it, yet the phrase captured how the people imagined her: callous, decadent, blind to suffering. The truth was more complex. Marie Antoinette was not indifferent, she was overwhelmed. Her inherited vulnerabilities, anxiety, depression, impulsiveness, were magnified by the chaos of revolutionary France. Her attempts to navigate politics often came across as erratic, bursts of bold defiance followed by periods of crushing despair. To some, these swings looked like arrogance. To others, hysteria. But beneath them was the same fragile psychological inheritance that had marked generations of Habsburg women. By the time revolution engulfed Versailles, she was already broken in ways few could see. Witnesses described her alternating between frenetic energy, plotting escape, writing desperate letters, and long silences where she seemed lost in thought, dissociated from reality. Guards noted her confusion during interrogations, her tendency to drift away mid-conversation. They saw not a queen, but a woman fraying under impossible pressure. Her trial in 1793 was little more than a performance, a foregone conclusion. Accused of treason, corruption, and even incest with her own son, a charge as grotesque as it was baseless, Marie Antoinette stood before her accusers with a kind of weary dignity. She denied the lies but did not plead for her life. By then, she seemed resigned to the fate that had stalked her since birth, a pawn of dynasties, now a scapegoat of nations. On October 16, she mounted the scaffold in Paris. Witnesses recorded her final composure, her whispered apology to the executioner when she accidentally stepped on his foot. It was a small, human moment, a flash of grace from a woman the world had turned into a caricature. The blade fell, and with it ended not only her life but the illusion of Habsburg invincibility in France. Yet her story, like that of Maria Anna, Joanna, Margaret Theresa, and Anna of Austria before her, is less about crowns and politics than it is about the human cost of obsession with bloodlines. Marie Antoinette's downfall is often remembered as the triumph of revolution over monarchy. But beneath the political narrative lies another, equally tragic. The way a young woman, shaped by genetics and trapped by dynasties, was broken by pressures she could never hope to withstand. She was not the frivolous monster of propaganda, nor the saint some later painted her to be. She was, above all, human, a Habsburg daughter, burdened by centuries of choices not her own, undone by a destiny she could not escape. By the late 17th century, the tragedy of Habsburg bloodlines had reached its crescendo. The grand palaces of Madrid and Vienna no longer rang with the laughter of healthy children. Instead, they echoed with coughs, with whispered prayers, with the shuffle of physicians' feet. The dynasty that had once seemed unstoppable, stretching from the Americas to the heart of Europe, was rotting from within. And at the center of that decay stood the most tragic of all Habsburg rulers, Charles II of Spain. Charles was born in 1661, the son of Philip IV and Maria Anna of Austria, yet another uncle-niece union. From the beginning, his body bore the full weight of inbreeding depression. His lower jaw jutted so far forward that he could not properly chew. His tongue was so large that speaking was an effort. He suffered from epilepsy, rickets, and infertility. His body was frail, his intellect limited, and his immune system so compromised that he seemed constantly ill. Modern geneticists have calculated that Charles's inbreeding coefficient, a measure of how closely related one's parents are, was higher than that of the child of a brother-sister union. He was, in effect, the distilled product of 16 generations of intermarriage. He lived for nearly 40 years, but in those decades he embodied the dynasty's undoing. He was unable to father an heir. His body could not sustain the very purpose for which generations of Habsburg daughters had been sacrificed, the continuation of the bloodline. But Charles was not alone in his suffering. Around him were the Spanish infantas, the royal daughters and cousins whose lives became case studies in genetic collapse. Palace records described their conditions with chilling detachment. Some could not walk properly until late childhood. Others suffered epileptic seizures that left them bedridden. Many developed severe spinal deformities, respiratory illnesses, or neurological impairments. To their families, they were still bargaining chips, married off to cousins across Europe despite obvious disabilities. To history, they became evidence of what happens when power is preserved at the expense of humanity. Yet if we step back from the palace walls, a larger story emerges, one not only of tragedy, but of science. The Habsburgs became, unwillingly, one of the most infamous genetic experiments in human history. Today, we call the consequences inbreeding depression. When close relatives reproduce, harmful recessive genes, usually harmless when paired with a healthy copy, become unmasked. Each generation increases the likelihood of deformities, infertility, and mental illness. The Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism, became the dynasty's visual emblem, but it was only the surface. Beneath it lurked immune deficiencies, developmental delays, and psychiatric fragility. The evidence was there for contemporaries to see. Physicians in Madrid and Vienna kept meticulous records of symptoms. Courtiers wrote of miscarriages, infant deaths, and queens wasting away. Priests presided over endless funerals for children who lived only days. Yet the dynasty pressed on, marrying cousin to cousin, niece to uncle, as though blind to the pattern. Why? Because politics mattered more than life. To marry outside the circle of Europe's great Catholic houses was to risk weakening alliances, to dilute the sacred bloodline believed to be touched by God. The Church reinforced this illusion, granting dispensations for unions that bordered on incest. Royal blood was treated as holy relic, to dilute it was seen as sacrilege. The result was a system that perpetuated itself long after its human cost was obvious. And that cost was borne most heavily by women. Queens and princesses became vessels, their bodies treated as laboratories for the dynasty's survival. Maria Anna of Austria, Joanna of Castile, Margaret Theresa, Anna of Austria, Marie Antoinette, all endured lives of pain, confinement, humiliation, or early death. Their humanity was always secondary to their function. They were daughters, sisters, brides, and mothers, but rarely allowed to be simply women. Yet from their suffering, modern science has drawn knowledge. Geneticists studying the Habsburgs have been able to trace how repeated cousin marriages amplified recessive disorders. Historians of medicine have connected their struggles to the broader development of understanding heredity. These women, who were denied voices in life, have, through their illnesses and deaths, taught us about the dangers of ignoring genetic diversity. Their tragedy has become our warning. The Habsburg line in Spain ended with Charles II in 1700. His death without heirs plunged Europe into the War of Spanish Succession, reshaping the continent's political map. In one sense, his passing was the inevitable conclusion of a dynasty that had chosen power over survival. The bloodline had collapsed under the weight of its own design. But the story did not end there. In Austria, the Habsburgs continued, though with less extreme inbreeding. Cousin marriages persisted in European royalty well into the 19th century, but the lesson of the Spanish line lingered. Dynasties learned, slowly, reluctantly, that survival required new blood, that purity was a myth paid for in suffering. Today, when we look back at the portraits of Velázquez, at the medical notes of royal physicians, at the letters of queens begging for health, we are reminded that history is not abstract. It is flesh and blood. These were not just monarchs, but people, children who could not run, women who died in childbirth, men who wasted away under the burden of their own heritage. And yet, in their suffering, there is also resilience. Joanna of Castile, locked away for 46 years, never lost her fierce love, even if it was branded madness. Margaret Theresa, frail and dying at 21, still fulfilled her duties with dignity. Anna of Austria, crushed by miscarriages and humiliation, still found strength in her faith to endure. Marie Antoinette, mocked, slandered, and condemned, faced her execution with quiet courage. Their legacies are not just warnings about genetics or dynasties, they are testimonies of human endurance. They remind us that behind every crown is a person, and behind every portrait a story of pain and survival. The curse of bloodline purity has ended, at least in its most extreme form. But the temptation it represents, the urge to value ideology over humanity, tradition over compassion, power over love, remains. The women of the Habsburg dynasty whisper across centuries a lesson as urgent now as it was then. Nobility is not in blood, but in recognizing our shared humanity. They ask us not to remember them only as queens or madwomen, as portraits in museums or names in genealogies, but as people who deserved better than the fate imposed upon them. People whose suffering helped illuminate truths about biology, politics, and the dangers of blind tradition. In their silence, they still speak. And their message is clear. Never again should power be built on the sacrifice of human lives. Never again should purity be prized above compassion. Never again should we forget that true strength lies not in the narrowness of a bloodline, but in the vast, diverse, resilient fabric of humanity itself. History's secrets don't end with this video. Show your support with a like, share your thoughts below, and subscribe so you're here when the next mystery unfolds.